Welcome to the WanderLearn podcast. I'm your host, Tapon. In this episode, I interview Trent Hone, who is the author of Mastering the Art of Command. This is a book about Admiral Nimitz, who led the United States in World War II in the Pacific. He was United States Navy Admiral. Now, you might wonder what this has to do with wandering. Well, I like to wander all over history and also learn about what sites that we can go in the Pacific Ocean that could be war tourism sites. The other thing is I want to delve in a little bit more about the current challenges that we face. I ask him questions about the United States Navy, whether it should be downsized, could hypersonic missiles make navies obsolete, and what did he think about the recent Taiwan war game scenario? Is this like the last time that we should be able to visit as tourists Taiwan before it goes under? I've always wondered, why does the United States military have to be so big? What would happen if we just shrank the size of the military to about 25% or less of its current size? And then what does he think about the current Russo-Ukrainian war and how will it end? Hope you enjoy this. I want you to start by just telling a little bit about the character of Chester Nimitz, who was an admiral for the United States Navy during World War II. Tell me that story about him crashing a plane in San Francisco Bay Area. I think that's just a telling story about his character.
This plane crash is, I think, an excellent story that provides a window into Nimitz's leadership style, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to include it in the book. So it happens in late June 1942, after the Battle of Midway. Nimitz and members of his staff are flying from Pearl Harbor to San Francisco, and they are in a seaplane. And the seaplane is coming down into San Francisco Bay. It's supposed to land there, and normally a water landing would be fine, but it turns out there was some debris in the water, and it wasn't seen until it was too late. So the plane hits the debris and flips over. The hull is pierced, and it's going to sink. So Nimitz and the other passengers in the plane are thrown about. He happens to be in a chair that is facing backward, so he's hurt a little bit less in the impact. He doesn't have any major injuries, but nearly everyone else on the plane suffers one or more broken bones. The pilot was killed. Lind McCormick, who is the head of Nimitz's war plan section, breaks two vertebrae in his back. Boats are coming out of the plane, a rescue effort, and Nimitz refuses to get into one until everybody's out of the plane, until all the injured people and the pilot's body are out. That happens before too long. Also, the corpsmen who are showing up, they're putting blankets over the injured people. And supposedly every time one of these is placed on Nimitz, he takes it off and he puts it on someone who's more injured because he's still physically able. He hasn't been hurt terribly badly. And he starts to get in the way. And one of the seamen who's conducting the rescue effort is like, get out of the way. Not really concerned about rank, doesn't really know who Nimitz is, but knows he has a job to do, get the injured people out of the plane. So he chases Nimitz into a boat. And as Nimitz is in the boat, it's starting to sail away from the wrecked plane, and he's standing up in the back, and he's got a blanket around him now to help keep him warm from his wet clothes. And the coxswain, who's running the boat, essentially is the captain of that small craft, says, sit down, you fool, you're endangering yourself, get down. Nimitz does, and as he sits down, his arm insignia shows up out from underneath the blanket,
showing his rank.
And the coxswain is, showing his rank. Full admiral here, just got yelled at. And so, so the coxswain who welded him is trying to apologize, like, I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to. Don't write me up or anything. And Nimitz's response, I think, is fantastic. He's like, nope, stick to your guns. You were right.
Right. Yeah, no, that says so much about him because, he was basically yelled at twice, chewed out by, the rescue crew, and then again by the guy who's manning the boat. And in both cases, he didn't try to pull rank or, get offended. He just humbly said, okay, yeah. And also the humility of handing over the blankets to the people who are in most need. For those who are trying to visualize that is the, remember when that plane landed in the Hudson River? That was kind of a similar story when they had to make a fairly quick evacuation. And he was Nimitz was one of the last to get off that plane. Amazing story. A lot of people who are listening to this podcast like to travel. And so if there are history buffs and who love history stuff, is there a place in the Pacific that you would really recommend going to? Like the first thing that came to mind, of course, was Pearl Harbor, but that maybe is a little bit too low-hanging fruit, but maybe something a little bit more exotic. Where would you want to go? Or maybe places that you've personally been to that really were compelling places that were scenes of important World War II history in the Pacific Ocean?
You're making me a little jealous with that question because I haven't been able to travel extensively in the Pacific. I have been to Pearl Harbor. I do think that is a really interesting place to visit because what impressed me was its small size. You can see the films, you can look at pictures, and with the battleships lined up there, it gave me the impression that Pearl Harbor was a larger place. But you go there and you see it, you see Ford Island, and you see the remains of the battleship Arizona, and it's small. And it's no wonder that naval officers before World War II felt like it could be a bit of a trap. Because there's not much room to maneuver. So Hawaii, I think, is an excellent place to visit. Other places that I think would be really interesting that I would love to see, I'd really like to go to Lunga Point at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands because I've seen photographs of Salvo Island, which is across what the Navy sailors called Iron Bottom Sound because of all the fighting there, all the ships that sank. And Salvo Island is not very far away too. So this is another small area, but this is an area where there was a lot of battles, a lot of fighting in a very condensed space. I think the Marshalls would be very interesting, especially Kwajalein, which was a major objective of Nimitz forces in early 1944. I think the small size of those atolls would really convey an impression of just how little terrain there was in the Pacific, particularly the Central Pacific, and how it's dwarfed by the surrounding waters. I've heard some stories about how moving visiting Saipan is. Saipan was the scene of a great deal of fighting in the mid-1944, and a very sorrowful event. There were Japanese civilians who lived on Saipan, and they had been convinced that they would be horribly abused if they were captured by the forces of the United States, and so some of them threw themselves off a cliff on the island. Basically jumped to their deaths. And I'm told that visiting that spot can be quite moving. The sands of Iwo Jima, there's a famous movie that name, but I have a small vial that a friend brought me back from a visit there of that sand. But that would be, I think, a very impressive place to visit. How alien that landscape seems to be because it's a volcanic island and sort of atypical from other places that humans normally inhabit.
Iwo Jima is near what? I don't even know where it is. Is it near Guam?
No, it's south of the Japanese home islands, and not too far south. It was within.
So south of Okinawa?
No, east of Okinawa.
Okay, I guess I got to pull out Google Maps.
It's in the Bonin Islands.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to go there because apparently that was. I mean, that was obviously a titanic battle, and it was covered in a couple of movies as well. Did you watch those movies, the two movies that were made by Clint Eastwood, I believe? And did you feel that was relatively fair depiction?
I've seen the one. I haven't seen the other.
One was from the perspective of the United States, and then one was from the perspective of the Japanese.
Exactly. It struck me as the one that I did see as quite a good movie. It's a really desperate fight because by this time Iwo Jima is invaded in early 1944, and the Japanese know that as far as war material goes, right, the ships, planes, ammunition, etc., they cannot compete with the forces of the United States and its allies, and so they have shifted to a strategy that is designed to injure, kill, maim as many Allied soldiers as possible, soldiers and Marines. And so that's what they're attempting to do in Iwo Jima, not necessarily win, not kick the Marines off of the island, but just kill as many of them as possible so that they can undermine the morale of the people of the United States and convince them that the war isn't worth fighting. Not to is not that it isn't worth fighting at all, but that it isn't worth fighting to the degree that would be necessary to impose unconditional surrender on Japan.
I'm going to ask you two what-if questions that, counterfactuals that historians like to occasionally entertain. I guess some of them hate to do it, but a couple of them. One is the idea that what if those aircraft carriers that had normally been stationed in Pearl Harbor had been there? In other words, let's say the Pearl Harbor attack was pretty effective overall. But imagine if it was even more effective, like it really knocked out the entire Navy there. A lot of ships were kind of like, I think only the Arizona was completely obliterated, but almost all the other ones were just kind of maimed and could be brought back to life and resurrected one way or another. But what if it had been more devastating? Do you think that would have been a blow that would have taken out, or would have just made it so that the war ended in 1946 or 1947 instead of 1945?
This is an excellent question, because one of the things that I tried to really draw out is, we tend to think of, or evaluations of the Pearl Harbor attack tend to focus on the material damage, and that's important, right? You said Arizona is destroyed. Oklahoma also does not return to service. That's another battleship, and many others are damaged to varying degrees. Some of them don't return to the war until a good number of years later. If carriers had been there, then it becomes, there's more significant material damage, but it also becomes more significant psychologically, because there is less to strike back with. Nimitz would have had less material to begin to initiate offensive operations and go after Japanese positions with the earlier carrier raids. So I think there's even a possibility that something far more serious happens in the Pacific if the carriers are there. Far more serious from the standpoint of the Japanese may be able to consolidate their positions to a large extent. There may not be any substantial offensive operation in the Pacific for a long time, and maybe the American people get to the point where they don't think it's worth it. Maybe we end the war in 1946 or 1947 with significant Japanese dominion over large parts of the Western Pacific. It's probably unlikely, but I think it's a possibility that if we're dealing in counterfactuals, we got to entertain.
Maybe, Trent, it would be either the war ends in 1947 with a U.S. victory, or it ends in 1942 with a Japanese victory. Let me ask you one more counterfactual, which is, when I was growing up during the Cold War era, we had this kind of standard line, which is the two nuclear weapons that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were justified, because if we had not done that, then it would have cost millions of U.S. lives, and that's why we had to do it. And if we hadn't, then Japanese wouldn't have surrendered. But recently, in the last few years, I've kind of noticed that there's a lot of pushback on that narrative, and saying that, no, those bombs were completely superfluous, and they really were just a war crime, and we would have won the war. The Japanese were going to surrender, and they were completely unnecessary and cruel. And so what is your take on those two nuclear bombs that we dropped? But one more thing, and other people saying, no, it's actually good that we dropped them, because then people could see how devastating they were, so that then if we hadn't dropped it, then we would have entered the Cold War with a bunch of nuclear armed states, and especially the USSR and US, without having known what a nuclear bomb does to a population. So it's actually good that we had these, little tiny nuclear bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so that we said, wow, if those little tiny bombs did so much damage, can you imagine if we dropped our 20 megaton bombs on our cities? It would be 1,000 times that. Anyway, so go ahead and answer.
I do think that there has been a lot of good research lately into this question and the dynamics of the emperor, and I say that specifically, the Japanese emperor's decision to surrender, or at least to accept sufficient terms that would bring about the end of the war. Because if you look at the timelines, it seems apparent that the first atomic bomb and the firebombing campaign before that hasn't led the people responsible for Japan, and particularly the emperor, to believe that surrender is the right course. And then coincidence, the several factors happen in close succession. You get the second bomb, so there's a realization on the Japanese part, well, this is not a fluke. This is a weapon that the United States has and is willing to use. And also, the Soviets invade in Manchuria, and they tear through Japanese positions. And I think it's those things, as well as the growing realization on the emperor's part. And I think the Soviet invasion is one of the triggers for this, but I think there's a whole series of factors that lead up to it. The emperor begins to recognize that what his military advisors are telling him is not true. He can't trust them anymore. And they've been saying, look, Japanese culture and people, we will survive. We have the wherewithal to resist sufficiently, even though we're going to lose islands and positions, etc. We can resist our enemies. And I think that he starts to realize that perhaps that's not true. And so he's staring at this possibility that Japan will be crushed to the extent that that his line and the nation as he believes it to be may become no longer viable. And so he takes steps to try to preserve it. And surrender is a step that can do that. And so he buys into it. One thing that I don't think gets looked at quite enough in the debate that may also have been a factor in that decision making is the degree to which the conveyance of supplies and material in and around the home islands was being curtailed by mining. Many of the B-29 missions were dropping mines to prevent the movement of ships and material. Japanese railway ferries were being destroyed by American carrier planes, and so there's starvation that the home islands are facing that I think would have been absolutely terrible in 1946 if the war had been allowed to continue.
You think that those nuclear bombs were in fact a game changer? In other words, it definitely was maybe not the straw that broke the camel's back. Maybe the straw was the Soviets coming in or something else, but it was certainly one of the many straws that were thrown on that did make a decisive difference. And without that, maybe the war would have been prolonged and mass casualties would have come some other way.
Yeah, I think they're important in that they do feed into Japan's decision making. Right. I don't think that they are decisive in and of themselves. I think it's a compounding of these various factors.
Okay, so why did you write the Mastering the Art of Command? I mean, there's a lot of books on World War II, and what was the purpose for you and the audience that you had in mind in your latest book?
There are a couple different reasons. The one is I wanted to extend the approach that I'd taken with a prior book called Learning War, which looks at the U.S. Navy in the early 20th century as a complex adaptive system, as a way to try to explain and understand learning and innovation, particularly in the U.S. Navy, but sort of more broadly in human organizations. And I wanted to extend that by looking a little bit more at how an individual or individuals could exert influence in a system like that. Because there's some people react to this idea of complexity and looking at complex systems with the feeling that, well, if it's all these intermingling factors, then what influence do individual humans have? Why should I do anything if it's sort of all these constraints that are around me and the influence of all of us sort of acting together that lead to these broader trends that sweep people along. What role do individuals play? And so I wanted to look at that, and Nimitz seemed like a very good vehicle for that.
But what about MacArthur? I mean, MacArthur was also an individualist. I mean, he was kind of in some ways personified individualism even more than Nimitz.
Oh, absolutely. I think MacArthur would be fascinating. There are a number of good studies of his. I remember relying on Rich Frank's. Rich Frank has written, it's not a very big book, but it's quite good on MacArthur. And Peter Dean, yeah, it's over here on the shelf so I can see it, has written, he's an Australian, and he's written a book called MacArthur's Coalition, which looks at how MacArthur waged the war, particularly the early portion of the war when he was making extensive use of Australian military forces. And as you can imagine, Dean's perspective, reflects sort of the Australian perspective, but also I think it is a fair assessment of MacArthur's leadership ability. So I'd recommend both of those. But I mean, when you come down to it, part of the reason is the Naval Institute was looking for a book on Nimitz, and they asked me if I was interested. And if you're like me, interested in naval history, enjoy researching these subjects. When someone comes knocking and says, "Hey, would you write a book on Nimitz?" Yeah, you don't say no.
Yeah, I mean, and your book has such an incredible level of detail. It made me think that you were a fly on the wall. Like, how did you accumulate all this? Because I'm a writer as well. And I know that for every 10 words I write, I delete 9 of them. And I'm sure you're probably the same way. I mean, in other words, what a lot of people who read books don't realize is that most writers write do an incredible amount of research, and only a tiny fraction of all that is actually put into print. And so when I'm reading your book, I'm like, my God, this is like the filtered version that we're getting, which is still jam-packed with information. What level of detail you must have gone through in order to just say, okay, these are the chunks that are still worth putting in. And there's got to be so much detail. I don't know how you accumulate all this command unless you are about 150 years old and somehow you were there.
I was not there. I wish for some of these conversations, I wish I was, because the Navy had a habit, and Nimitz embraced it, of having these conferences. They would bring people together. I mean, today we call them meetings typically, but bring people together, share ideas, and hash them out face to face, and try to work through agreements that make sense and that bring diverse perspectives together. And records of some of these are preserved. Like, there are minutes from the regular conferences that Nimitz and King had. There are minutes from the conferences that Nimitz had with Gormley, the commander of the South Pacific area in mid-1942. But some of these other conferences, there aren't. We have personal recollections, and we have records of the decisions that emerged from them, but we do not know, who said what or in what sequence specifically. And so it was important to me to try to get different perspectives on some of those conferences, to try to draw those details out, to sort of extrapolate from what we did know, to draw some intelligent conclusions or guesses, I guess, about what did happen in some of those sessions. One thing that I think it's important to remember, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's a great deal of writing that doesn't make it into the book. And the Naval Institute has some targets in terms of, what size they think works for a book, how long it should be. And initially I was far in excess of that.
You had what, 500,000 words?
It wasn't quite that many, no, but I'll just say it was significantly over their target. Yeah, it was in that neighborhood, 200,000 or so. And I had to get it down to, I think the final count was somewhere around 130. So there's a lot, that's about a third that didn't make it.
And for those who don't know, for a writer to chop away, like going from 200,000 words to 130,000 words, it's like you having 5 babies and somebody telling you have to kill 2 of them.
It felt like that sometimes. It did. He's like, what do I mean, it's already down to the bone. What do I cut? And I need, 3,000 words out of this chapter.
But I will say this, though, Trent, is that whenever somebody puts a gun to my head and forces me to cut, despite all my objection, I have to be honest and realize that after all said and done, when I look at it 5 years later, I realize, you know what? It's a better book because I did cut that out. But at the moment that you're doing it, you feel that it's so utterly wrong.
Yes. And you get creative. Like, how can I turn this paragraph into a sentence?
Right,
like, what is the
exactly.
most important thing about this paragraph? And how do I keep it in there? And I do think, to your point, I do think it made the book stronger. And I think in some respects it moves faster. Some areas it moves faster than I wanted it to, but it is. I tried to squeeze as much of the essence of everything that I had found into the book.
One of the takeaways, and tell me if I think you agree with me or maybe or not, but the United States military, a lot of people focus on the sheer materiel or the volume and the technology and the sheer industrial might that its military have and the numbers and all that stuff. But from your book, it seems that one of the key takeaways is the real true secret sauce of the United States military is its adaptability, its ability to kind of be not so much command control all the way down from the very top. It gives commanders on the ground a lot more flexibility, and it's more decentralized, especially in the case of Admiral Nimitz. But I think that same kind of attitude pervades in many other of the branches as well. And that is the secret sauce that many other militaries, and we're looking right now at the Ukraine-Russia war and Russia having some severe problems, and a lot of people identifying it's because it has such a top-down structure and doesn't give as much flexibility to the commanders on the field. Is that a fair summary of one of the secret sauces of the United States?
I think so. Or it's certainly something that I tried to draw out here in this context. And I know others have tried to do it in other U.S. military contexts in World War II or elsewhere. There's a good book, I think it's called, if I remember right, it's called Closing with the Enemy. I can't remember the author, but it's about how the subtitle, I think, is How the GIs Fought the War in Europe. And it talks about that. It talks about the Army's ability to adapt to the specific context of the war in Western Europe and adjust, tactics and techniques to try to overcome their German opponents. And Frank Hoffman has written a good book recently, also by the Naval Institute, called Mars Adapting, which is a series of case studies about U.S. military adaptation in wartime. This is a subject that is, I think, getting more study. And I think it's really important because there are going to be mistaken assumptions. And what I thought was really interesting looking in detail at the Pacific War, speaking about assumptions, Imperial Japan and the United States go into the war with different assumptions, almost different paradigms for what kind of war they're going to fight and how they could achieve victory. The theories of victory are different. And so what you see in its early phases is wrestling over this context. Which of these nations is going to be able to impose its sort of context for the war, its theory of victory on the other? And eventually the United States and its allies gain the upper hand there. Nimitz is a key part of that. But the ability to adapt and adjust, not just to Japanese tactics and techniques, but also to the nature of the war in the Pacific is part of that. Tying it back to materiel, I do think that one of the things that really comes out when you look closely at the history is, yes, the United States produces a vast amount of material, right? The arsenal of democracy, it's true, it's there. But that material has to be in the right place at the right time. Otherwise, it's wasted. And so there is a great deal of effort, and we see adaptation and individual initiative and creativity here to figure out how logistics ought to work in the Pacific, how to get that material to the right place at the right time in a way that supports the rapid pace of operations that's going to be necessary to bring the war with Japan to a conclusion as early as possible. And so it's, I do think that that kind of creativity and adaptability, to your point, is one of the secret sauces of the United States. And it's something that, nationally we try to encourage, or at least we tell ourselves that we try to encourage that, right? Entrepreneurship is an American theme.
Right. And it's a hard thing to kind of teach other cultures. So now what we will do this is the end of part one, and we talked about the history. In part two, which will, for those who will tune in next week on our next podcast episode, I'm going to ask you, Trent, a bunch of questions regarding the present day and kind of the future. And just to tease out that episode, these are the questions we're going to talk about. Hypersonic missiles. Will they make navies obsolete? What about the recent Taiwan war game scenario? And what do you think about it? And what happens if we could shrink the United States military, United States Navy, to 25% of its current size? What would happen to the world? And what do you think about the Russian-Ukrainian war that's going on, and how do you think it was going to end? That is what we're going to discuss in the next episode. Are you going to be ready for that, Trent?
You're going to make me stick my neck out and go beyond what I'm really comfortable with. But
subscribe to this podcast, and then you'll listen to it next week. Here we go. And that ends this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we've talked about, go to WanderLearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is always my social media username. My website is ftapon.com. Do you want to leave me an anonymous voicemail where you can make a comment or ask a question? Then go to speakpipe.com/ftapon. Furthermore, if you'd like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. Now, 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at WanderLearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.